Good evening. It's good to see you here tonight. I want to thank Gilbert for preaching this morning. Normally, the Sunday after Christmas, Keaton is gone to visit family, and so we try to figure out if I'm going to preach or whatever. And Gilbert said he had something on his mind, so he was able to do that this morning, and I'm glad that he did because we're all blessed by that. But tonight, I guess Gilbert didn't want to preach tonight too. I'm just kidding. I'm happy to take 1 Samuel chapter 30 as well. We are going to pick up in a story that, as you've probably noticed several times as we start in some of these chapters, they start with with a sentence or a phrase that tells you it's part of an ongoing story. And that's why we do this in a linear way. And that's why we are taking story by story, chapter by chapter, because they build on each other. And in 1 Samuel chapter 30, we're going to look at, as Keaton said last week, several interesting things about the way that David handles difficulty and the way that his influence on the Israelites is going to develop even more, especially as we get closer to him actually assuming the throne of Israel in a formal way, even more so than God's choosing of him. So in 1 Samuel 30, we come to this phrase in verse 1 that says, "Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire." I don't know if you're like me, but at this point in the real depths of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you get to some of these names that you're really just not sure when you read them if you're reading the name of a person or a place. Is that just me? I mean, Ziklag, is that a place or is that a person's name? Some of these get really weird, and so we have to get that straight first. Well, Ziklag is a place, and then it talks about the Amalekites in verse 1 as well, who are the people who made a raid against this place, and also the Negeb. The Negeb is also spelled sometimes with a V at the end, Negev, and all that is just the area in Judah or southern Israel, the southern part of the Promised Land, you could say. And Ziklag was a town in this area. Now, I imagine, especially because of all of these different even after the conquest of Canaan, and even after Saul has been king all of the time that he has, there's still all of these little bands of troublemakers all throughout the land. And if you kind of look at a map, you notice that, as it says here, one of those is the Amalekites. You've also got, as David has dealt with several times, the Philistines. So you have the Philistines are causing problems in the land that is supposed to be Israel's. And you've got the Amalekites who are causing problems here. Later, you'll have the Edomites, and you'll have the Jebusites, and all these different little bands of people that are causing problems for God's people. And this story deals with the Amalekites. Now, one of the questions I had when this came up was, why this place, and why is this necessary? Why is this place associated with David, and why are all of his people and his men, and why are all of their families, their women and children are here as well? Because again, it's not really a place that we deal with a lot of times in Scripture. This is one of those few times that this place is mentioned. Where did Ziklag come from? Well, if you remember, as we're building on this story a little bit every time, if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 27, back when David had this issue, the situation where he decided to flee to the land of the Philistines, while he was being buddy-buddy with one of the Philistine kings, Achish tries to give David, in being buddies with him, he gives this town, this city, this settlement to David. And so this becomes one of David's little strongholds, where all throughout the land of Israel, he has several places that are especially loyal to him. And really, as you think about how David is growing influence in this area, remember, Saul is technically, officially on the throne. David has been anointed king by Samuel on God's behalf. So you have a weird dual kingship happening, where one is official and one is really the rightful king. But in that time, David really is commanding a militia. And a militia would be more of just like a small band of an army. You're not talking about, he doesn't have command of the entire, the army of Israel, because he doesn't have the power to do that technically, legally. But he has these men that are loyal to him. And they form a militia that are going to carry out David's play. And that's where you get phrases that we've read and seen several times. Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000s. It's because they each are doing their battles in different ways. And the way that David is with this little militia that he has. But it's apparently really effective. This militia is apparently really effective, as we'll see the rest of this chapter. So that's how he has Ziklag, and that's why there are all of his men and their wives and children are stationed here, you could say, at base at Ziklag. But while they had gone down to, if you look in the last chapter, as they're coming back from the land of the Philistines, they are tired, and as they are tired and basically just limp back to their town and just hope to get back to take some rest, as soon as they get there, they notice there's an obvious problem. First of all, there's no one there. Let's keep reading in verse 2 through 3. The last sentence of verse 1. They had overcome, this is the Amalekites, they had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters had been taken captive. So you notice not only is this place probably first of all on fire, it has been razed with a Z. It's gone. It's destroyed. You can tell this is a problem. And they get up closer and they realize not only is it destroyed, but there's nobody left here. They have taken our wives and our children, and everyone in the city have been carried off by these Amalekites, this band of troublemakers and actually, as we'll see a little bit later in this chapter as well, there's a very good chance, well, this is the way that it's written in the story, that these Amalekites were basically hopping from town to town and just plundering and plundering and plundering and amassing this big growth. So they might have been growing as they, traveled among these lands in the south of Israel, where they would plunder this town and they'd gather all their people and just march them all the way across to the next one. And then they would capture that town, and they would just cause a bunch of ruckus and a bunch of trouble. Now, it says that they killed no one, but they carried off everyone and went their way. It's kind of interesting. This place, Ziklag, is also, if you're just trying to connect the dots from other passages in Scripture, this is where David's mighty men, that's talked about in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, this is the place that they are going to join up with him. Just kind of an interesting little point to notice. But about Ziklag and about this place that they were located, David only had this place and had control of this place because of a bad, unnecessary alliance with a pagan foreign nation. Remember, he was given this place by Achish, the king of Gath, the Philistines. This was not a place that was given by God or that it was taken by God's power and God's providence and help in David's life. This was really given because of an alliance with a foreign nation. Something to keep in mind that's interesting. And then about the enemy, about these Amalekites, again trying to put together a little connection of what we're reading in Scripture. You think back to 1 Samuel chapter 15. Who was it that was supposed to have destroyed the Amalekites completely? Like left no one alive? Saul. Saul was already supposed to have handled these people through God's hand. God had already executed judgment on them, and he said, don't leave anyone. And somehow, this is what happens when disobedience gets left unchecked. You have not only was it a problem for Saul, the immediate consequence was the next chapter after that happens is when David is anointed king, because God says, clearly this King Saul is not going to do my will or obey me. So then the immediate consequence is David becomes the new rightful heir to the throne, the anointed king of God. But then further down the line, it even causes problems for somebody who didn't have fault in the first place. Just a reminder that sin has consequences, has generational consequences. It's not like we often think of sin in a way that it is, or disobedience to God is, it's just contained to me. And it's not a big deal as long as I can handle it, or as long as whatever justification we can come up with in our mind. But the reality is when we go about our life in a way that disregards God or his commandments, we're not only causing problems for our own life, but it affects those who come after us. No sin, it reminds me of those, I guess, I don't remember if it was like on DVDs, when you'd play a DVD, it would say piracy at the very beginning. Piracy is not a victimless crime. And it was like a big deal. They were like, please don't copy this DVD onto something else. Sin is that way. Sin is not contained only to you. It is not a victimless crime to other people. Sin, as much as you want to contain it to yourself, will end up affecting other people. Now, whether that's ourselves, if I hold in sin and I'm not held accountable, then obviously it's going to affect my relationship with my wife, who is the closest to me. That's with our spouse is going to be the most obvious. But then it affects the way that we parent, affects the next generation, and what is permissible and how far could that train go. It could be really bad. It's just another good thing to remember. But I say that all to say about the location and about the people that are attacking David's people. Both of those things, Ziklag and the Amalekites, shouldn't be in the picture at all in any way whatsoever, right? They really shouldn't need to have this stronghold of Ziklag, and they also shouldn't need to be dealing with the Amalekites again. So that's what provides this really unfortunate scenario setting for what's going to happen in verses, or what has happened that we just read. Now let's read verses 4 through 6. In verse 4 it says, after they realized that this place had been burned with fire and their people had taken captive, David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives had also been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was also greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. This is what we just read there at the end is the phrase that Keaton said, is so cool to look forward to. And this is another hint at David's character and how he truly represented God and God's own heart in whatever scenario he came across. The setting was obviously very unfortunate here. The way that things were set up, this place and these people that were going to cause trouble for him. But the way that David reacts is how we want to learn, what we want to learn from. It says here that David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Well, that is a very impactful statement. But let me also suggest, who else was he going to use to strengthen him? If you read this, first of all, his two wives had been taken away by the Amalekites. He didn't have family there. The other thing was, all the people spoke of doing what? Stoning him. He didn't have any friends that were going to sit by his side and say, it's all going to be okay, David. He had nobody around him. So it's always difficult to try to determine, whether or not something that happens, and maybe you think about this a lot in your life personally, but it's always interesting to think about when something happens, is it, God directly caused this, or did God allow this, or how does that work out with God's provision? But I want to suggest that maybe this might have been a scenario and a moment in which was crafted by God to create a scenario that David had to rely only on God himself. And again, the reason I say that is because he uniquely had no friends or family to rely on in this moment. But then also, as it says later on in the chapter, for a little bit of a spoiler, they end up recovering the wives and children and all of the spoils of this war completely unharmed. It says that no one was killed in this process. And so I almost wonder if this was a moment where God put David in a situation to force him to realize what it means to truly rely on God. And that gives a lot of special importance to the story. Again, that may not be the case, that it was God who crafted this scenario. But either way, as God guided David's footsteps in one way or another, it led to this moment. And there's a moment for David to learn from this scenario or not. And this would be a prime example of a good lesson to learn, to truly, without any other option, rely on God himself. That begs the question in verse 6, what does it mean that David strengthened himself in the Lord his God? What does it look like to strengthen yourself in the Lord? Well, the next couple of verses give us a great example of that, and a really good pattern that we can even follow, I would suggest, that we can not only learn from in theory, but also put this into practice as well. When you're going through something that is so troubling or difficult or exhausting, maybe try this. How did David strengthen himself in the Lord? If you read the next couple of verses as well, let's just read it. Verses 7, the end of 6 through 9. It says, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God, and David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band, and shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. So David set out and took 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook of Bezor, where those who were left stayed behind. So immediately after the scripture giving us this example that and saying that David strengthened himself in the Lord, it tells us a little bit about how he actually did that. It's one thing to say that David strengthened himself, but it's another thing to actually explain what he did in steps to do that next. That's the thing that we love to pull out of a passage, is some practical application. Well, here's the three things I would say that are really going to be easy to remember are the way that David strengthened himself. First of all, in verse 6, he took stock of the situation. Now, I'll be honest, when I was first just trying to kind of find a way to communicate this, I almost first said that he tuned out the noise, and he got rid of everything in his mind and cleared his head and got out of the way. But when I thought about it a little bit longer, I realized that's not really what happened. I mean, he's got people bearing down all around him, pressuring him, threatening to stone him. So I wouldn't say that he necessarily just said, oh, la, 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 I don't want to listen to you. It was more that he took stock of the seriousness of what was going on. And also, it helped, if you could say it that way, it helped that his own family was part of the loss here. I mean, it'd be one thing for him to say, la, 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 deal with it if it's somebody else's family. His family was part of this loss. So he has to take it seriously, obviously. So it doesn't say that he tuned everyone out or didn't pay attention to what was going on around him. He heard the people that were bitter in soul, and then he did something about it. So he took stock of the situation, didn't tune out the noise. He took stock of what was actually going on. That would require listening to the people around that are trying to tell you what's going on and how difficult it is. The second thing he did in verse 8 is he took counsel from the Lord. Again, a really practical example here of what to do. Take stock of what's going on and what the situation is, and then look for the Lord's guidance and counsel. In this moment, he literally was able to speak to the Lord and to hear an answer about what he should do. Thankfully, we have the benefit that David did not have, that we have the whole counsel of God here that we need to know. And not only through that, but through prayer, to actually seek the counsel of God in the scenario that we are distressed about is vital to actually strengthening yourself before God, to take the opportunity to see what God would have to say and what his will is. Because here in verse 8, David has a difficult scenario, and he's trying to decide whether or not he should go out in battle to pursue them. And then he finds out through God's counsel that will happen. Now, the third thing is, after he took counsel with God, the third thing is that he trusted in God's answer. After after seeking God's will and God's counsel, he actually trusted enough in that answer from God to act upon it. If you see in verse 9, it says, David set out and took 600 men with him. So not only was he willing to figure out what the situation was, to go to God and ask what he should do, then he had the opportunity to actually choose to act on it. And that's what he did in verse 9. And I would argue it's a really good pattern to follow in terms of strengthening yourself in the Lord. That's not just a theory, that's what David did, and it worked very well. And you see really the scenario here in the chapter. This is a cool example of this. The story kind of just gets better and better. Like you start out really grim because obviously the women and the children are just gone and the city's burned. But as you read a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, the situation gets a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter and a little bit better. And I have to say that has to be because of how David handled himself in this moment, how he actually responded to the difficulty that he was facing. So beyond trusting in God's answer and acting on the ability or the answer that God gave and trusting in that, then what he does with that is he takes that opportunity to go and actually get something done for his people and for God. And that's when he goes out to defeat the Amalekites. Along the way, if you want to, we'll skip over this just quickly, but in verses 11 through 15 is a little bit of a side story about how they find the Amalekites. They find a servant of one of the Amalekites who they had just left behind, which they probably thought was easier and not a big deal. Well, that's actually how David and his men find a way to track down the Amalekites. They use him as a little bit of information, and they actually find them. But another thing in verse 10 about the way that this happens is, and this actually matters for a little bit later in the story, David pursued the Amalekites, and he took, he says he took 600 men in verse 9. Well, then when they get to a certain brook, which also could be very likely that it was a ravine. Also keep in mind, the Negev is like a very waste desert area, probably especially then. And so if this brook that it's talking about here in verse 9 was probably most likely in like a ravine. And so they would have had to traverse down into it and then maybe get back up. And so it's a very tiring, difficult scenario. But also keeping in mind that they had lots of luggage with them. They had packs on their back, and they were carrying food and maybe animals or whatever it was. They were carrying all these things. And so to get 600 men down in that ravine and then all the way back up, also keep in mind, back at the beginning of this chapter, it says that they were, it tells us here about their scenario at the beginning of the chapter. They were tired. They were tired. When they got to Ziklag, they had already just overcome a really long journey to get to Ziklag. Well, then they're emotionally tired, distressed, because they've lost their family. And then they have to immediately embark on this other journey. They're very tired. And it tells us 200 of the 600 men are just not able to keep going. But they also, again, all of the luggage and the bags and things probably need to stay with them. And later it tells us in verse 24 that they were there to stay by the luggage. That's what it says. So it only takes 400 people with him. Let's start reading in verse 16. So now David has moved on. He's got 400 people with him. And in verse 16, it says that when they had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad all over the land. This is the Amalekites. So you can picture this. The Amalekites, when they found them, were spread abroad all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and the land of Judah. Remember, that's what we were talking about, that the Amalekites had gone from town to town and just caused a ruckus and spoiled from all of them. That's where they're getting it all from. Well, they're just enjoying it out in this desert area. They found a place to spread out and have just a good old time. And they're enjoying their spoil. In verse 17, David struck them down from twilight until evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, verse 19, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken, David brought back all of it. David also captured the flocks and the herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, "This is David's spoil." David was confident enough in God's answer that he was willing to go out and fight for it. That's a whole different thing when you consider that his life was on the line in doing this. You know, we're trying to equate this to our own lives. It's great when we try to do our best to follow God, but our life is not literally on the line. Think about how much was at stake here. His life, but also his wife's life and his all of his men and their families. This was a big deal. No wonder they were so distressed. So following God had eternal consequences, literally. It had mortal consequences to what was going to happen. Something that it tells us here is that when David struck them down in verse 17, that it says not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode off on camels. Now, how many men did David bring? 400. So maybe just picture the size of this band of Amalekites if only 400 of them escaped. This is a pretty big feat that David and his militia have accomplished here. Now, they attacked, surprise attack and had the advantage tactically, I guess. But it tells us, we don't know the exact number of the Amalekites, but if it says that only 400 escaped, they must have been a pretty big number. Something to notice that's interesting. And then in verses 21 through the rest of the chapter, it's more of a discussion about what they were going to do now that they had recovered everything that they had lost. And I think this probably tells more about David's character than, or at least as much about David's character as the other half of the story does. Because what happens is these men the 400 who had actually gone out to fight the battle, who had put their lives at stake for all of these women and children and the plunder that had been taken from them, they believe, it says not all of them, but some of them. In verse 22, it says, all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone, they said this, because the others, the 200, did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart. Their plan was, since we had done the hard work, since we'd done the heavy lifting, we'll take all the gold and the food and the herds and all the good stuff because that's our reward, that's our payment for showing up. That's our overtime pay. And they're just going to they'll be gracious enough to give the other men who stayed with the luggage, it says, give them their wives and kids back, I guess. And David said in verse 23, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given to us. He has preserved us and given us into the hand of the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into battle, so shall his share be who stays with the luggage. They shall share alike. So these men try to take a selfish, almost jealous position about the spoil. And they say, we've done the work and we won this battle and we did all the heavy lifting. And so we ought to get more. And David says, that's not how it works in God's kingdom. And it's cool because that makes, I guess, logical human sense. We could agree with that. It'd be very tempting for any of us in that scenario to feel like the ones who are actually, who've actually put their lives on the line should get more. That makes logical human sense. But David said, we are going to have a higher standard than that. We're going to live better than that. And then that principle actually goes further than just affecting those men in the battle. And this is where I think it again speaks to David's character. Not only was he willing to stand up for those 200 men who deserved a part of the spoils and about what had happened, but then he takes that principle and says, this is actually going to apply to all of the region that we live in. So here's what he says in verse 26. When David came to Ziklag, they got home. He sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, "Here is a present for you for the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." And it was for all of these names. You can read them right there in the next three verses. So when he gets back home, not only does he say that those who are part of the army, the militia, get the spoils, but he says we're actually going to share with our neighbors and our friends as well. And one reason that's really important that David does that is really because they also had suffered by the hands of the Amalekites. Remember, the Amalekites were going around and they were stopping at this town and taking a little bit here and destroying them, and they jump over here and take a little bit and destroy them and take a little bit over here. And so what David is doing is he's providing aid to the region. He's saying, hey guys, let's share this. Let's give back and try to set things right. Now, David could have, by all human logical considerations, kept it all for himself. Matter of fact, they actually said at the end of verse 20, this is David's spoil. But David was a strong enough leader to suppress his selfishness and his desire for more wealth and gain than he deserved, that he chose to share it and to give it to those who needed it more. And that would make a whole lot of sense why so many people loved David as a leader. I mean, those 400 may have been a little frustrated at him then, but think about the impact that David was able to have then over all of these cities in the tribe of Judah who needed help at this point and were given it by David because he cared and he thought to consider them. That's a big deal. A couple of thoughts just to conclude as we learn from this scenario. I think one thing that I think about is we started at the beginning with the terrible situation that it was. You know, all the facts about how we got here and why we're here are really negative. And we could spend all day long thinking, well, if this hadn't happened back in history, then we wouldn't be here. And if this person had done this, then blah, blah, blah. Thankfully, what David does well here, and in a lot of scenarios, is he has really good situational leadership. It reminds me of the great philosopher Elsa of Arendelle. Actually, I don't know if she's the one who said it, but it was in Frozen or something that said, you've got to do the next right thing. Maybe it was Anna, I don't remember. I'll go back and watch it for you, don't worry. Maybe it was Anna said, you've got to do the next right thing. So again, you can't sit and just wonder at all times of every day and say, oh, well, blah, 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 if this hadn't happened, or if this person hadn't left me with such a bad scenario, or if they hadn't done this and they hadn't done this. It's about just choosing to do the good thing now. And so David has really good situational leadership. Think about all the plot points of this story. He heard the pain of his men that he also shared in. He heard the pain. Then he strengthened himself in the Lord. It's a good step. He consulted the Lord because of that, and he actually asked God for his will. They actually moved on that and set out to retrieve their women and children and the spoil of the war. He allowed the exhausted men to take respite at the brook. He could have forced them to keep coming. He could have been a slave driver and said, come on, who cares if you die now, you'll die later anyway. He allowed them to remain and rest. That was good leadership. He gave them a new purpose in doing that too, to watch the luggage. That was probably a help for everyone. That was good leadership. He actually went out and won the battle. Winning the battle, good leadership. And then he distributed the spoils from that battle generously and with integrity. Also good leadership. At every step of the way, he takes the opportunity to try to do the next right thing. And that's one of the great things about King David. Right here, just before he becomes officially crowned king of Israel in the next couple of pages of the Bible. The other thing I noticed from this, and I think is good for us to remember, especially as it pertains to other Bible stories and other passages that we read, David doesn't write beautiful psalms that we read about and love without going through just horrible bottom-of-the-barrel moments like this. And I think that's something we struggle to realize in our life a lot. I think, man, I'm just on fire with the movies today. I think it was in Evan Almighty, Morgan Freeman said, If God, you've heard this before, probably in other places as well. If you pray for patience, do you think God's going to give you patience, or is he going to give you the opportunity to be patient? Right? It's not that God just snaps his finger and gives you a trait. It's that through living life and doing it how he's asked you to, you learn these things. And so David just didn't become just a beautiful poet. I mean, he became that because he went through deep, deep trouble. And he was able to take that pain to God and write beautiful things and make beautiful art that we still get to, we also benefit from today. So again, that's good in understanding David. He didn't just have the highs of his life that just created a great triumphal story, but also good for us to remember. We don't just have those same, like, as we expect, triumphal moments of our life that just make us better or wiser people. It's that David had that because he went through difficulty, and he chose to learn from that and take it to God, and that's important. And a good example of that as we close today, just turn over to Psalm 18. There's a chance that this was written, I don't know about exactly after this exact instance in 1 Samuel 30, but it says actually in the little heading there that this is at least from this time period-ish, before he becomes king, officially crowned king, and while he is running from the hands of his enemies and from Saul. And this is the thought process that goes through David's mind. Now, also consider the fact that most Psalms are, 7, 12 verses. This one, about the deepness of his despair and his need for God, this one is 40, 50 verses long. But this is what he says. I'll just read the first 3 verses, and you're welcome to continue to read on later. But he says this, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and I'm saved from my enemies. Obviously, there's several things there that you wonder, maybe it was connected to the story in 1 Samuel 30. It says David strengthened himself in the Lord, and that's the same language that's being used here in Psalm 18. The Lord is my strength. And it's him realizing that led to the growth that he did. And again, remember, all of this growth and all of the wisdom that he learns and the leadership that he exhibits, all of this is being formed in him before he ever puts the crown on his head. And that's important to remember about leadership in general. I think about the way that they treated him at the beginning. His men were about to stone him. And I think about this with leadership sometimes. Sometimes you get really frustrated. If you've ever led anything before, if you think about it this way, sometimes you have really harsh critics, and people are just really frustrated because they just can't see why you didn't do it a different way, or why you couldn't have done something to benefit them more. Something you think about next time that happens is, if you just remember that the people who say stuff like that have probably never led anything before. I see some nods along that line. If you've led something before in anything, however big or small, you realize that a lot of times criticisms come from people who don't quite understand what leadership is like, and how in leadership you have to make difficult decisions and do difficult things. And so, first of all, that's helped me in understanding when I lead something, how to not get frustrated at people. But again, I think about David had to remind himself that it was the Lord that was the source of his strength, not other people who don't quite understand what I'm actually going through and what I'm trying to do here. But what a good reminder of the product of David's life and leadership. These Psalms that we love and that we go to, Psalm 23 of comfort, Psalm 51 of his repentance and confession. These come from going through a difficult period of life and learning from it. And that's the amazing thing about David that we can see, especially here in 1 Samuel 30. But that also means we have to learn from the difficult periods of our life as well. If you have trouble doing that, if you have a need tonight to put on Christ in baptism, if you need to seek the Lord and be strengthened in Him rather than trying to just do things of the world to make your life better, I can assure you it's not going to last. Only the Lord can be our strength, like Psalm 18 says. If we can do anything for you tonight, I hope that you'll come forward now as we stand and sing.